What does it take to bring a nation to surrender? In the Far East, the heavy bombers of the United States Army Air Force continue to incinerate Japanese cities. Aircraft and submarines strangle the country's shipping and choke its war industry. The Emperor and his government have now finally realized that ending their war of aggression and barbarity is the right course of action. But as the months drag on, they waste time on internal fighting and debates. As the talk continues, the destruction only grows. This is episode 137 of War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. We left the U.S. bombing of Japan on the morning of March 10th after a massive firebombing raid by the B-29 superfortresses of Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command left Tokyo a sea of flame. Codenamed Operation Meeting House, this 300 bomber raid killed over 110,000 people, left about 1 million homeless, and destroyed 16 square miles of the Japanese capital. In the 10 days afterwards, the B-29s also struck twice at Nagoya and once each at Osaka and Kobe. After these raids, there was a pause in the firebombing campaign as LeMay's forces had burned through their stock of incendiaries. Once his supplies are replenished, LeMay goes straight back to the firebombing campaign. On the night of April 13th, 300 B-29s returned to Tokyo, targeting the Arsenal district northwest of the Imperial Palace, where explosives, gunpowder, munitions, and associated electronics are manufactured and stored. As well as the large factories and warehouses, there are hundreds of small home-based manufacturing shops. By morning, over 11 square miles of the district is left in ashes. 2 nights later, the bombers returned to target the port of Tokyo, where the warehouses, docks, and shipbuilding facilities extend across into neighboring Kawasaki and Yokohama. By the morning, 6 square miles of Tokyo, over 3 square miles of Kawasaki, and 1.5 square miles of Yokohama are burnt. LeMay's bombers also contribute to the blockade of Japanese shipping. This is called Operation Starvation and is the brainchild of Chester Nimitz. Back in summer of 1944, the Admiral proposed blockading Japan's ports and waterways using airdrop naval mines. The logic is as follows. Japan imports most of its war production material from China, Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies, as well as much of its food. Other raw materials had to be transferred from the islands of Kyushu and Hokkaido to cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe, and Hiroshima, which form an industrial belt running along the southern coast of the main islands of Honshu. Blockading the ports and preventing such transport would bring Japan's war economy to a halt. As Indy covered in a special last year, Allied submarines are already strangling Japanese shipping, but it is only with great risk that the subs can access areas like the Inland Sea, which separates Kyushu and Honshu, through which 80% of Japanese shipping passes. Initially, head of the USAAF Henry Hap Arnold was strongly opposed to this suggestion. The B-29 is the Air Force's premier strategic weapon, and he set up the 20th Air Force under his own command specifically to prevent the bombers from being diverted at the request of individual theater commanders like Nimitz. If Arnold agreed to Nimitz's request, what was to stop Louis Mountbatten or Douglas MacArthur from making a similar ask? But eventually, Arnold realized that a mining campaign would increase the chances of Japan surrendering without an invasion. In addition, when Curtis LeMay took over 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, he became a fervent advocate of the strategy, seeing it as an extension of his strategic bombing campaign. LeMay gives the job to the 313th Wing of the 21st Bomber Command. After training, the wing devotes more than a month to mining the Inland Sea. From March 27th to May 7th, the bombers fly 246 sorties and drop over 2,000 mines. They completely block the Shimonoseki Strait, which gives access to cities like Osaka, Kobe, and Kyoto. Japanese shipping traffic through the strait drops by 90%, with the vessels rerouted to ports on the coast of the Sea of Japan. Not only does this mean a longer journey by sea, but it also means the goods have to be transferred to their final destination by train, further straining the Japanese railway system. Subsequent phases of Operation Starvation target Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo bays. Then, the ports on the Sea of Japan are blockaded, as well as other ports on Kyushu and Honshu. Rerouting ships becomes incredibly difficult. Further missions blockade the ports on the northeast coast of Korea. By the end of the campaign, over 12,000 mines will have been laid, 5,400 at the Shimonoseki Strait, 2,300 in the Inland Sea, and almost 4,000 around ports on the Sea of Japan. With near total air superiority and little to worry about from ground-based flak, just 15 bombers will be lost in over 1,500 sorties. The mines sink or disable 670 ships carrying 1.25 million tons of cargo. Together with the subs and carrier-based planes, they reduced Japanese shipping capacity to a tiny fraction of its capacity in 1941. Meanwhile, the rest of 21st Bomber Command continues hitting Japanese cities with incendiaries. After a brief interlude from April 16th to May 11th, in which LeMay's forces strike Japanese kamikaze airfields on Kyushu and Honshu, the bombers begin a new firebombing campaign against Japan's largest cities. Over the next 30 days, the bombers fly 11 missions, some counting over 500 aircraft. They strike Nagoya on May 14th and 16th. 4 square miles of the harbor area are burnt to the ground. Coupled with the earlier raids, that leaves 16 square miles of the city incinerated. After these raids, 21st Bomber Command removes the city from its list of targets. There is not enough urban area left to burn. On May 23rd comes the largest raid on Tokyo. 520 bombers burn out 5 square miles of Tokyo's docks and factories. 2 days later, the B-29s return, and 464 bombers use thermite cluster bombs to whip up major fires, targeting a mix of governmental, financial, and commercial buildings. They destroy another 22 square miles of the city. By this point, 51% of Tokyo's urban area has been destroyed. Like Nagoya, the city is no longer worth bombing. Yokohama faces the same treatment on May 29th, the first time the city is singularly attacked. Osaka is bombed on May 31st, Kobe on June 5th, and Osaka again on June 7th. With that, LeMay calls a halt to this phase of the bombing campaign. For 6 of Japan's 10 largest industrial cities, there is simply not enough urban area left to make firebombing worthwhile. Of the other cities, Kyoto has been spared for its cultural significance, and Hiroshima because it is an atomic bombing target. Fukuoka and Yawata will be targeted later. LeMay and 21st Bomber Command have already decided on the next course of action. Codenamed Empire, the B-29s will soon move down a rung and begin targeting Japan's mid-sized cities. At this point, it's worth asking ourselves the obvious question. By mid-June, huge swaths of Japan's major cities have been reduced to embers. The country's shipping is being strangled by the mining campaign and the submarines. Iwo Jima has fallen. The defenders on Okinawa are in retreat. Chiang Kai-shek has scored a big victory in western Hunan, and the Japanese know that the Soviets are moving huge forces down towards the border with Manchuria. So why does Japan keep on fighting? Well, the public rhetoric of Japanese Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and the rest of the government and armed forces will continue to emphasize the fight to the death. And yes, Japan does still control huge swaths of the Asia-Pacific region and still has many millions of men under arms. Already the government is planning to increase that number by building a vast civilian militia to oppose any invasion. But as Indy has spoken about in his episodes, a peace faction has developed within the Japanese government and even within the highest level of the military. Even Kantaro Suzuki privately makes some statements in favor of the idea. When it comes to Emperor Hirohito, we saw in our War Goals special episode back in February that he approved the army's plan to fight the war to the bitter end, but by now, he too has adjusted his views in favor of peace. You will have heard of some of how this goes down in Indy's June 22nd episode, but here I have the opportunity to go into a little bit more detail. Hopefully, as I give you even a simplified version of this horrifically complex tale, you will see why the Japanese are simply unable to make any serious strides towards ending the war. Now, the highest decision-making body is the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, which consists of the Big Six cabinet ministers. These are Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Army Minister Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Yoshihiro Umezo, and Navy Chief of Staff Suemo Toyoda. These men are split between the peace faction and the militarists. On the peace side, we have Togo, Yonai, and Toyoda. Outside of this big six, the peace faction also counts former Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, as major supporters. Opposite these figures, we have the hawkish figures from the army. When accepting his appointment back in April, Anami did so only on the condition that the war would be fought in line with the army's plan for ultimate victory. That would be a final, decisive battle fought on Japanese soil that breaks the fighting spirit of the Western powers and leads to a negotiated settlement favorable to Japan. The only alternative to this is death. After months of cagey, euphemistic debate and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, things start to come to a head in early June when the peace faction decides to enlist the emperor to break the deadlock. Kido drafts what he calls Kido's tentative plan for the termination of the war. Both the peace faction and the Hawks have rejected any possibility of talks with the Western powers, so at the heart of Kido's plan is the idea of sending a personal letter from the emperor to the Kremlin, seeking Soviet mediation with the West. He hopes that this will carry more weight than the back-channel efforts that the peacemakers have so far gingerly explored. When Kido presents his idea on June 9th, the emperor approves. For his part, Hirohito has been having doubts about the army's competence for some time. These were only reinforced as the Japanese forces on Okinawa were forced into retreat from the end of May. On the morning of June 9th itself, the emperor had in fact received a depressing briefing on the depleted state of the Kwantung army in Manchuria. With that information, Hirohito concluded that neither the Kwantung army nor the Homeland army would be able to effectively oppose the USSR or the Western Allies. There is still the problem of the army, but Kido also manages to deal with this, at least partially. By mid-June, Army Minister Amani has already lost some of his earlier confidence, and Kido thinks he can be turned. Kido visits the general on June 18th and explains that an American invasion threatens not just military defeat or a communist uprising, but an existential threat to the Japanese kokutai. Kokutai is something of a tricky term, usually taken to mean something along the lines of the Japanese national essence or polity. The government produced an official interpretation before the war, and this combined various spiritual, cultural, ideological, and political elements into an explanation of what makes Japan unique. Preservation of the kokutai is essential for preserving Japanese sovereignty and the legitimacy of the imperial system. Kido asks Amani what would happen, for example, if the Americans capture the imperial regalia, the three sacred objects of Japan which symbolize the emperor's divinity. Surely it's better to seek peace with the West, prevent an invasion, and preserve the kokutai, even if that means making other concessions. At first, Amani argues that his forces can defend the homeland, but eventually he is swayed by Kido's logic. Amani promises that at the very least he will not oppose efforts to enlist Soviet mediation to end the war with the Western Allies. That brings us to where Indy left the story in his June 22nd episode, where this all comes to a head in a meeting at the Imperial Palace. There, the Emperor officially orders the Big Six to seek Soviet mediation. Both of the army representatives, Army Minister Amani and Chief of Staff Umezo, give their approval to the idea. The Emperor will dispatch former PM Fumimaro Konoe with a note to Moscow in early July. But the truth is that it's too little, too late. The die is already cast. The Soviets have already agreed to enter the war against Japan and have no intention of acting as mediators. Nothing the Japanese do will change this. In fact, we know this because other elements of the peace faction have already tried pretty much the same tactic. For the past month, Foreign Minister Togo's special representative Koko Hirota has been having secret talks with Soviet ambassador to Japan, Yakov Malik, at the Hotel Gora in Hakone. Although Hirota hasn't actually asked for mediation. The Soviets have guessed that's what he wants. Stalin, Molotov, and Malik have all agreed that the best bet is to string the Japanese along for as long as possible, giving time for the Soviet armed forces to prepare to invade Manchuria. As we shall see, Konoye gets the exact same treatment in the run-up to the Potsdam Conference. Meanwhile, in Japan, the national inertia continues. Without any movement towards ending the war, the Japanese army exhorts its people to fight a final battle on the homeland that its government knows they cannot win. As the Japanese government wastes their time on internal squabbling and a futile appeal to an enemy in waiting, Japanese cities continue to be incinerated. LeMay's B-29s rain their incendiary bombs on Japan's middle-sized cities. The targets are so much smaller than previously that multiple cities can be hit in a single day by dividing up the bombers. On June 9th, Atsuta, Akashi. On June 15th, an incendiary raid on Osaka and Amagasaki. On June 17th, there are incendiary raids on Omuta, Hamamatsu, Yokkaichi, Kagoshima. June 19th sees raid on Fukuoka, Toyohashi, Shizuoka. By the end of the war, the estimates of the dead will range somewhere between 300,000 and 900,000. Over 8 million will have been left homeless. The cities of Japan's industrial belt will have been obliterated, many of them suffering complete destruction of over 60% of their urban areas. The firestorm sweeping through Japanese cities has left the emperor and his bureaucrats with no illusion as to what a failure to surrender will mean. Yet no surrender comes. Instead, they send vague signals that look more like a tactic to delay and build up their defenses. Instead of admitting defeat, the public blustering about a defense to the last drop of Japanese blood continues. It obfuscates the reality that, like a bull struck so many times by the picadors in the arena, Japan is already bled to near death. And facing this dying, raging bull that continues to lower his horns, scrape his hooves in threatening anger, is a matador that is about to be handed the mightiest sword ever forged. A sword of fire and brimstone that will destroy far more than the bull, alter the course of history forever, and send the world shaking in fear for the very existence of humanity. Never forget.